One thing about China that I would like to emphasize, China went from 80% extreme poverty in 1980 to no extreme poverty 40 years later. It is the most successful economic development in history. It learned a lot from Korea, by the way. It learned a lot from Japan. It learned a lot from the neighbors. It's extraordinarily successful. Life expectancy rose enormously. Education rose enormously. Quality of life rose enormously. Hunger fell completely. This is an accomplishment. We should take joy in China's accomplishment, not fear from it. We should congratulate China for its good works, and we should sit down and understand each other, because there is so much common interest, but we don't even talk to each other. We point fingers. We say they're on the other side of the divide. We don't want to talk. The first bit of wisdom, to go back to Socrates, is to talk.
Everyone, I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. In February of this year, the Chinese government celebrated the eradication of extreme poverty within its borders. Now, this would be a massive achievement for any country, but for China, even more so, as it's home to some 1.4 billion people and is considered a developing country. China's credited with lifting over 800 million people out of poverty, which accounts for 70% of the world's total poverty reduction. This is a massive feat, and it's worth understanding how China did it. To do just that, I'm joined by Tings, Chak, a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute, a member of the Dongsheng News Collective, and she's the lead author of a report titled Serve the People, the Eradication of Extreme Poverty in China, which everyone can go check out at the Tricontinental website. Tings, welcome.
Thank you, Rania. So glad to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on to talk about this report in particular, because it's so comprehensive. As you know, of course, it not only includes facts and figures, but you guys provided this deep analysis of the poverty alleviation program in China, how it worked, why it worked, and you incorporated on-the-ground field research and interviews with experts, which is just so incredibly fascinating. And I really do encourage those who are watching and listening to go actually read the report. But for those who are watching and listening, I don't think people in the West really grasp just how huge it is that China managed to eradicate extreme poverty. So just to start off, can you give our listeners and viewers a brief overview of what this actually means in practical terms? Like, how do you define poverty, extreme poverty, and what does it mean to be lifted out of it? And then we can go from there.
Thanks, Rania. I think that's a great way to get us started. Maybe I can start with the story, because I quite like stories, and ultimately this is about, people's stories of, real people who get lifted out of poverty. And I got to meet one person in the process of doing this study. Her name is He, and she's herself a poor peasant from the countryside in the southwestern province of Guizhou, which is historically quite a poor, very ethnically diverse region of the country. So we walked around with her for a day. She's now a leader of the Communist Party of China in the local chapter, as well as of the Women's Federation in her community. And so her day looks like she wakes up at 7:30 in the morning. Mm-hmm. She drops off her kid at school, which is a 5-minute walk away. She lives in a community where she is also one of the leaders of, one of the 12 leaders of 18,000 people. In that community, there are 3 medical centers. There's a child care center. There's a primary school, a middle school, and also right next door is where her mother-in-law lives, and her, as well as her brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces. So just to get a sense, her life now looks like this. But just a few years ago, that walk just to drop her kid off to school might have taken her about 2 hours each way, just walking. A community health clinic or the nearest hospital might be, a day's ride away on buses plus walking. And now she lives in a community where those things are accessible to her. So in practical terms, as someone for her life, it is actually accessing those material things and being able to live in a community that where her kids and her mother-in-law can thrive. She says, I live upstairs, I work downstairs, and there's kind of 3 generations together. So that's a kind of story. quite typical of what you might hear of someone's experience, that in the process of like lifting themselves out of poverty, become also, leaders and protagonists in the process. Stepping back a bit in terms of how someone like her is defined to have lived in poverty and get lifted, as you asked. The program has a slogan, because here public policy often likes to use slogans with, kind of catchy phrases. So it's 1 income, 2 assurances, and 3 guarantees. What that is the first is income. Obviously, that's still the primary measure of how a person is doing, their income sources. Do they have work? So in China, the extreme poverty level is set at the equivalent of $2.30 a day. And this is, just so that you know, the World Bank uses $1.90 per day. So the China standard is actually a bit higher than that. But the Chinese approach wasn't just around income alone. I think what's more important to focus is these 2 other aspects I mentioned: the 2 assurances, which is that you don't have to worry about food and clothing, and then the 3 guarantees, which is that you are provided basic medical services, free and compulsory education, which in China is 9 years, and then safe housing. And they define safe housing as not only the structure of the housing, but that it has safe drinking water as well as electricity. So the actual program itself followed what's called a multidimensional approach to looking at poverty. It's not just about handing out money, and it's not just about your income, but actually kind of the various facets about what produces poverty and what maintains poverty. So according to this metrics, the 1 income, 2 assurances, 3 guarantees, the last 100 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty in the last 8 years. And that, as you mentioned in the figure of 800 million, that's the last 100 of that 850 million people. And just to get a sense of what that scale, what that number means, I mean, almost seems too big to understand. It's the equivalent of lifting up the Latin America plus the Caribbean and most of the US combined together. It would be if all of that population was living in extreme poverty that was lifted. And so globally, in this last 4 decades, China's poverty eradication programs actually lifted 76% of the world's poor. So contributed 76 of the global reduction poverty. So it's quite a historic feat, I guess, not only for China, but for really the world to pay attention to.
Thanks for watching the video, and please consider liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.